Hello. So let's talk about placement groups today. See, we will do theory this time. So placement groups are basically a bit more advanced, and we want to use them once we want to have control over our EC2 instances. Okay. So sometimes when we want control over EC2 instances, placement strategy, so we use these placement groups. Okay. Now, that type of strategy is basically called placement group. Suppose if we want control over our EC2 instance placement strategy, then that type of strategy is defined as placement groups. Then we can create a placement group and then we mention one of the strategies for a group. And what are the strategies? So we don't get direct interaction because we don't get direct interaction with hardware, AWS hardware, because it is cloud. AWS is cloud, so we don't get direct interaction with hardware of AWS. But we let AWS know that how we would like our EC2 instance to be placed compared to one another. Cluster. So first is cluster. Clusters instances are basically all the EC2 instances are placed at a single or in a single cluster. Clusters instances into low latency group in a single availability zone. Okay, single AZ you can say. Next is spread. Spreads instances across underlying hardware, maximum 7 instances per group per availability zone can be there, and this is used in critical application. Okay, we will see details in a second. And then third comes partition. Partitions are basically spreads instances across many different partitions. We just spread our instances in different partitions within an availability zone, and it can scale to hundreds of EC2 instances per group. In a group we can place many of instances, EC2 instances like Hadoop, Cassandra and Kafka do. Next comes placements groups cluster. Okay, now let's start. This is the first one, basically placements groups cluster. Let's start. So in this placement group cluster, all the EC2 instances are interconnected. Okay, you can see all the EC2 instances are connected to each other. In a same rack they are placed and in the same availability zone. So now this placement group cluster is this low latency and high throughput. It gives you high throughput. So in a network where low latency and high throughput is required, we can use placement groups like this. Okay, what are its pros? Pros is great network, 10 Gbps bandwidth between instances are supported here. What are cons? So if the rack fails, suppose, because all the EC2 instances are placed in the same rack, so if the rack fails, all the instances fails simultaneously. Okay, at the same time all the instances will fail and we will lose our instance. Next comes use case. So big data work that needs to be completed fast, at that time placement group cluster is used. Okay, those application that needs, as I said, that needs extremely low latency and high network throughput, then at that case we can place all the EC2 instances at the same rack and in the same availability zone using this cluster. Now comes placements group spread. Okay, in this case, when we asked for a spread placement group, all the EC2 instances are going to be located on different hardware. So as you can see here, we have 3 AZ availability zones and we have 6 EC2 instances. Basically in this we have 2 only. Total is 6. We have 2 EC2 instances per partition. Okay, and now what we will see, that these are groups basically, and these are located on different hardware. Suppose first is on AP South 1A, then next is AP South 1B, next is AP South 1C. So these are all different, located at different hardwares. Suppose EC2 1 is on hardware 1, EC2 next is hardware 2, other is on hardware 3, other is on hardware 4. So what does that mean? Well, what we get is that we can span across multiple availability zones and there is a reduced risk of simultaneous failure. And why so? Because if any of my hardware suppose fails, I'm pretty sure that my hardware 2 will not fail or my hardware 3 will be there to support. Okay, And so that is the benefit from it. What is the pros and cons now? Pros can span across different availability zones. Reduce risk is simultaneous failure, as I said. EC2 instances are on different physical hardware. So when they are on different physical hardware, if one fails, then another will be working. Now, what are cons of it? So basically, it is limited to 7 instances per availability zone per placement group only. Next is use case. So application that needs to maximize high availability, we can use it there. Next is critical applications where each instances must be isolated from failure from each other. Suppose if my first instance is failed now, and if we want to separate, isolate them, so that if my first instance fails, then another instance which is located at different hardware should work properly, should not be affected. So there we can use this placement group spread. Next we can use placement groups partition. In this you can see partition. And what is this? In this partition placement group, we can have instances spread across partitions, okay, in multiple availability zones. We can have 7 partitions per availability zone. So in this example, we have partition 1 in US East 1A, partition 2 in US East 1A, partition 3 in US East 1B. And on each partition, we could have many EC2 instances. You can see on this partition 1, we have 4 instances. In partition 2, we have 4 instances. Partition 3, we have 4 instances. We can take as many as we can. So in the first one, I have 4, second one, 4, 4, and all this. So why do we use a partition placement group? This is the question. Well, each partition represents a rack in AWS. So by having many partitions, we are making sure that our instances are distributed across many hardware racks, and so therefore they are safe from a rack failure from one another, as in we saw in cluster. As in our cluster, our EC2 instances were interconnected with each other, and if one fails, then all the system fails, all the EC2 instances fail simultaneously. But this is very different. This partition is very different from the first case. Okay. Next is up to 100 of EC2 instances could be kept, as I said. The instances in a partition do not share racks with the instances in other partitions. Next, a partition failure can strike many EC2 but won't strike other partitions. Suppose here, if in my partition 1, suppose there are 4 EC2 instances. So if one instance fails, then other instance would be affected. But the instances which are on different partition won't be affected. Other EC2 instances won't be affected by it. So this is something better. This is something advanced about this placement groups partition. EC2 instances get access to the partition information as metadata. They have images, they have metadata in that. Okay. So this was a placement group partition, and usually the use cases are going to be big data applications which are partitions aware. We have used like in our Hadoop system, we use partitions or buckets. So partitions there, that static partition and dynamic partition are use cases of this placement groups partition, like SDFS, HBase, Cassandra, and Apache Kafka. So I hope now here you have got placement groups partition, and now you can understand what are all the partition groups, and I hope now you can work on it. So next we will do some hands-on this. Till then, thank you.